Well, hello, everyone. This is Shannan Vance-Ocampo. I serve as the General Presbyter for the Presbytery of Southern New England, and I use she and her pronouns. And this is Connecting Our Conversations, our podcast space for conversations that push the edges of our faith and help us to deepen discipleship. The Presbytery of Southern New England is a regional governing body in the Presbyterian Church, USA. During the months of January and February of 2025, I am doing a special podcast series on being a Matthew 25 presbytery as a way to start the new year for all of us. You are hearing this podcast while I am away on sabbatical. I wanted to leave something behind that would be a ministry resource for the whole presbytery. We are a Matthew 25 presbytery, and so this work is at the heart of our ministry. In addition to this podcast, our presbytery meetings and gatherings in 2025 will also focus around various Matthew 25 themes and offer resources as well. This podcast series will explore all areas of Matthew 25 ministry, including a special episode on the history and theological why behind being a Matthew 25 church, including what intersectionality is and why it is at the heart of this ministry. For today's episode, we will be talking about the Matthew 25 focus on congregational vitality and what that means for us as people of faith. Today, we're going to be talking to the Reverend Nikki Collins, who is the director of the 1001 New Worshiping Communities Initiative, and also the Reverend Veronica Cannon, who directs the Vital Congregations Initiative. So a big welcome, Veronica, and a big welcome, Nikki, to the podcast.
Glad to be here.
Thank you.
So we want to start, of course, with introductions, and I'll give each of you a chance to introduce yourself in whatever way makes sense for you, whatever you want to share with us, so people can know a little bit about who you are in ministry. So whoever wants to go first is fine by me.
I'll go. Since Veronica and I are both motioning to each other, I'm Nikki Collins. I'm the coordinator of 1001. Like Shannan said, I'm coming to you all from Chattanooga, Tennessee today, and I have my companion yellow lab Barks on the floor next to me, whose voice you might hear at some point during this call. I've been in this role for about 6.5 years, and prior to that, I was serving as the mission coordinator for Cherokee Presbytery, which is Northwest Georgia. And before that, I was busy launching a new worshiping community in a coffee shop context in Flint River Presbytery down in Middle Georgia. So for 5 years, we operated a coffee shop and ran a new worshiping community in the midst of it. So it was a life-giving, beautiful thing to do. And it's fun to now be at this altitude, looking at all of the breadth of new worshiping communities across the PCUSA. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. And dogs are very welcome on the podcast. We have, if you look at our presbytery staff page, we have our office assistants also listed on the staff page.
Oh,
So
excellent for y'all.
it's a feature of our ministry during the pandemic, as they did for everyone.
Right.
So Veronica, tell us about you.
Yes, I am the manager for the Office of Vital Congregations, and I have been in this role for just a little over 1.5 years now, so I'm still fairly new to the position. And we have 3 people in our office, and we work on the Vital Congregations Initiative. I am located in Charlotte, North Carolina. Many of us, as you know, work remotely, so I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I do not have a companion here with me. I wish I did. I used to have one, but I don't anymore. But I'm glad to be here with you today and to do this podcast with you and your listeners.
Yeah, thank you, Veronica. And Veronica, of course, your family is very special in the PCUSA, as we all know. And Katie was your sister-in-law?
Sister-in-law, yes.
Sister-in-law, Reverend Dr. Katie Cannon, one of the first writers of womanist theology. I first met your sister-in-law when I was in high school, Veronica.
Oh, wow.
She came to speak at my home church outside of Philadelphia. They had adult education classes all the time, and our pastors like to bring, speakers who would kind of, give us something very different to think about. And Katie came, and she had just published Katie's Canon.
Yes.
I have a signed copy that she signed for me. I was a senior in high school. She was one of the first theologians I ever heard speak in a public forum. So I always
Yeah.
think of her. I always think of her, Veronica.
Yes.
So, as we continue in this vein of introductory experiences and information, let's just dive into these two areas. What is the Vital Congregations Initiative, and what is 1,001 New Worshiping Communities? Sort of the 101 of each of these, because I'm sure there's some folks in the podcast who don't know about either one of these. And so, if we could just start with what the ministry area focus is, what's the current portfolio looking like, what's the day to day.
Okay, I'll go first because mine is probably not going to be as long as Nikki's because they do a lot more work in her area than we do in ours. But in the area of vital congregations, we do something called the Vital Congregations Initiative. We just did a new manual and it is ready to be released now. And I'll tell you a little bit about what it was and then tell you what it is. It's almost a lot of the same work, but we rewrote the manual. It was a 3-year initiative, and we've narrowed it down to 1 year. And we also will now be providing coaches for the pastors who enter the cohort. We will be meeting monthly as opposed to quarterly, as we did before. And so we're hoping that by shortening the time period, we'll get more people that can come into the program and stay in the program because we realized it was just a little bit too long. Focusing upon vitality in congregations, we help churches that join the initiative to go through a series of things to help them look at the history of their church and to look at the community that surrounds their churches and try to help meet the needs that community may have. We believe that that's what really makes churches vital. It's not about the number of people you have in your church, nor is it about how much money that you have in your church, but really how you do ministry with people in the church as well as people in the community. And so we really try to help churches to become more vital by listening to their neighbors, understanding what their needs are, and the church trying to discern by God's will what the needs of that congregation are to help meet those needs. And so that's sort of in a nutshell what the initiative is all about. And we're hoping to start a new cohort with the new manual in early 2025. That one will be by invitation only. The first one, because we just want to have for lack of a better term, test kitchen to help people to go through the initiative. And then we will have open enrollment for the second cohort. That's also another change between the old one and the new one. We would start a new cohort once a year. We're trying to start at least 3 cohorts every year so that approximately every 3 to 6 months, we're starting a new cohort. And so we're hoping to start the first one in early 2025, and then the second one sometime in the summer, and then the third one in the fall.
That's great. And, I really appreciated the first itineration of Vital Congregations as someone who does, presbytery level work, because it was a helpful resource that we could give to some of our congregations, and those marks of vitality that were in the first resource were really helpful in thinking about how vitality can be holistic, and it doesn't have to just be one type of ministry, because churches are, very different and diverse and in all sorts of different types of communities, but that there's various marks of vitality that can happen. Are you still doing those marks of vitality in the
Yes, we are still using the 7 marks of vitality as a guide for our work as we discern God's will. And those marks really have been, whenever we do workshops for churches or presbyteries, a lot of people are really drawn to those marks because they really spell out how a church should be engaged in ministry and what that looks like. And the thing that I love about the initiative is that, or the marks, is that every church, as you said, has a different DNA. And so although you may have two churches that might have a similar ministry that they're engaging, the way in which they engage that ministry could look very different depending on where they are and who they serve. So
Yeah. Yeah. And we'll keep talking about vital congregations for a few minutes. One of the, podcasting from home and stuff. So for listeners, Nikki's had to step out for just a few minutes to get a delivery at her door. So we'll spend a little time, rather than back and forth conversational, we'll keep going with vital congregations for right now, and then Nikki will come back. So Veronica, I just want to read out the marks because I think they're really interesting. We actually used these marks last year in our Commission on Ministry in our presbytery. And then Ray Jones came, and Catherine Threadgill, and she was still with your office, to meet with us over Zoom. We used these for our devotions over 7 months in the COM and looked at each mark and watched. There was like some videos about each one and a little Bible study. And so we used that as our devotions last year for our COM as a way of just diving into them and thinking as a COM about what do these look like as we work and resource our congregation. So outward incarnational focus, which is a focus on the community and needs of neighbors. Spirit-inspired worship, worship to challenge, teach, and transform. Ecclesial health, sorry, not help. Decision-making, focus on removing things that are irrelevant, embracing the call of evangelism, showing the love of Christ through actions and relationships, empowering every member, helping people discern their gifts and calling, caring relationships, building relationships based on God's love, and healthy systems. Those are the marks, or no? Am I reading the wrong ones?
Well, some of the names have changed. And so you have
Okay.
ecclesial health is one of the marks, caring relationships, spirit-inspired worship is another one. Empowering servant leadership, which you also talked about, outward incarnation of focus, intentional, authentic evangelism, and then lifelong discipleship formation is this are the 7 marks.
Yeah.
I think they changed the names on them from the time that you went through them, but they had the same meaning.
Same meaning. And you know what I love about them is they flow right, and I'm sure this was intentional, they flow with that piece in the Book of Order about the marks of membership, right?
Right.
It talks in the Book of Order about, what does membership mean? And membership isn't about joining a congregation and having your name on the membership list and making a pledge. Those are important things, of course, but membership is more about embodying methods and ways of lifelong discipleship. And I like to take that and give it to our search teams when they're looking for a new pastor, because the role of the pastor is to help us live into the marks of membership, right? And so I always say to churches, because they look at that list and go, oh my God, nobody could ever do all that. And I say to them, well, no, you shouldn't. Like it should be something you work on in the fullness of your life. And one season you might be very focused on healing ministries, or you might be focused on, some outward expression of church. And so that these aren't meant to be a checkbox or anything, but more to be something that we can integrate into the fullness of our lives.
Yeah, and the beauty of it too is that because we all have different gifts and talents, that the church, any particular church can have people who are gifted in one particular mark, and there may be others who are gifted in another mark. It doesn't mean that you have to embrace just one mark or that you have to embrace them all, as you said, but you can. But once you have a relationship with your community and you find out what their needs are, then your church can discern which of the marks you might want to most use, and then work towards building efforts to and strengthen yourselves in those other marks. And so it's an ongoing, it can be an ongoing work. It's not a one and done type of thing. It is ongoing.
It's ongoing, and that discipleship is a lifelong journey, right?
Yes, it is. Exactly.
Yeah,
that's right.
We go through seasons and ups and downs of our own personal discipleship, and the same as when we're in a group of people as disciples, as a congregation, and doing our ministries.
And that also morphs and changes over time.
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. So this is active work, active ministry. It's really helpful, Veronica. And I hope that this is a workbook that we can, congregations can take a look at and find ways to integrate into their life and ministry. Talk a little bit about why this is Matthew 25, like why Vital Congregations as a Matthew 25 church.
Well, it is one of the legs of the stools of Matthew 25. And so, we're one of the legs of that stool. And so I think it's important for us to understand that this is one of the things that Jesus calls people out to do, to be in ministry and to engage with one's neighbor, loving and caring for others, and as you love yourself. And so I think it's important for us to really just to take upon those tenets in our personal lives as in the life of the church, and how we just respond to other people. I think it's just important to really love as God calls us to love one another, and to engage in ministry with each other to help build up the body of Christ.
Thank you. Thanks,
Mhm.
Veronica.
Mhm.
So Nikki, let's talk a little bit about 1001 if we can. What's going on in the world of 1001 new worshiping communities? And if you want to maybe define a little bit what one is. We do have one 1001 new worshiping community in our presbytery, and that's Latinx in Action, which is out on Cape Cod, which is one of the faraway places in our presbytery. And that's led by Katia Dacuna, who's the pastor of Alonzo Dacuna, who's the founding pastor of our Brazilian Immigrant Fellowship, which is also on the Cape. And Katia is a social worker and wanted to develop a new worshiping community that focused on the broader Latino community, not just the Brazilian community, but in the broader community that she felt a calling to and could see in her work as a social worker, but also to focus on the queer community, the LGBTQIA community, and ways to do ministry among them. And so they're related a little bit, the two ministries, but they're also separate and distinct. And so that's our current new worshiping community in this presbytery. But if you want to talk a little bit about sort of the big picture of new
Yeah,
worshiping communities and how they fit in the PCUSA.
I love the husband and wife teamness of that. We have one other community where something similar is emerging in Indiana. So beautiful ways for things to grow together. And I hope I get to the Cape to visit that soon. But anyway, the bigger picture of 1001, some of your listeners might not know, the whole denomination launched this effort in 2012 at the General Assembly that was held in Pittsburgh that year. And the vision was to have every part of the PCUSA engaged in starting new churches with the goal of starting 1001 new worshiping communities in the next 10 years. So in 10 years, we started about 700, 750. We're over 800 by the end of 2024. So we look forward to getting to that 1001 mark in the next couple of years. So that's been a really fun thing to do. New worshiping communities are experiments often in forming Christian community that often look very different from traditional congregations in the ways that they gather. They're trying on new forms of church and seeking to reach new disciples. So that is what makes a community new. And they do begin to gather around word and sacrament, though not usually or often in the very beginning, but later as the community grows together in their own faith and discipleship. Worship becomes a part of things. So I have a team. There are 9 of us who work across the country in different parts of the ways of supporting communities. So the Presbyterian Church has a system of grants to help new communities launch. And then to match that, we have a really robust system of training and coaching and support, starting with assessments to help a potential leader discern their gifts and fit for the ministry, to coaching as they go along the way, and training for the journey too. So it's really a beautiful wraparound support for a presbytery and a new leader. So you have a regional associate who covers the eastern half of the U.S. His name is Gad Empoyo, and he is also a new worshiping community leader in the Greater Atlanta Presbytery. So I hope Gad will get your way soon, and your presbytery will get to know him as you try to imagine more new worshiping communities.
Yeah, we've been in touch with your office just recently in the last few weeks. I did a site visit to that new worshiping community just a few weeks ago, and they're doing all sorts of really interesting stuff, and they're getting ready for your site visit to them sometime in the next couple months in next steps. And I know Katya has been going to some of the trainings that you've been having specifically for Latino leaders doing new worshiping communities, because you have some specialized resources in there for new worshiping communities that are in immigrant communities or communities of color. And I know that's been really helpful to her as she's been doing that ministry.
About 45% of the new worshiping communities that have formed are communities of color, and most of those are immigrant communities. And the largest subgroup of that are Hispanic, Latino, Latina communities. So we have worked to contextualize many of our resources in Spanish. And we've basically recreated many things with the guidance of our Spanish-speaking leaders. So it's been a beautiful process, and one that I hope really serves the growing part of the church.
Yeah, we're excited about what they're doing out on the Cape. And tell us a little bit, Nikki, from your point of view about how new worshiping communities fits into the call to be a Matthew 25 church. How does that all fit together from where you sit?
Yeah, well, when it comes to congregational vitality, I think new worshiping communities really speak to the ecosystem of a whole presbytery, right? And our connectionalism. And that to be vital and healthy and growing, we need different kinds of things existing together, right? In an ecosystem. And so when we seed our presbyteries with new worshiping communities, it helps strengthen the churches that are already there. We do better together when we have a diverse ecosystem rather than one monoculture of a lawn. So new worshiping communities are bringing a lot of that to presbyteries. Like I mentioned, 45% of our communities are communities of color. And you know that's not what the PCUSA looks like right now. So new worshiping communities are helping us grow in ways that make us look more like the world around us, like our neighbors. Many, probably most of the communities that are active have identified justice work as an important part of their ministry. And I think many do start in working towards racial justice, particularly since 2020, and also food insecurity. So we've been working in race and justice issues, which were two of the other primary Matthew 25 foci, through new worshiping communities since the beginning, because we know that people gather around action, right? It's this action and contemplation. So they go together really well. And I think that it's just provided a really rich environment for the church to learn how to do those things and grow in response to that.
It's really helpful. The last presbytery I served, Albany Presbytery, we launched a couple new worshiping communities while I was there. And they really are so niche to what's going on in that context. We had a pastor who was part-time at a little tiny church up in the Adirondack Mountains. And so she was supplementing her income because she was part-time as a ski instructor in the winter months and a whitewater rafting instructor in the summers. So like a secular, job. But what she realized as she was having time with people in the boat, whitewater rafting or on the lift, going back and forth, up the slopes on the ski slope, that people had all sorts of spiritual wonderings and questions, but were disconnected from traditional, church, and also had, deep affinity for the created order, for creation. They were, outdoor sports people and loved being outside. And so she started a new worshiping community for that community. And it really took off, and they were having worship outside. I went to their first worship event. I always tell people about this. It was February, and it was on a yurt on the side of a mountain, and they had like this big bonfire going, and we had hot chocolate, and I had this huge puffy coat on and everything. But then in
I
the
want to be
summer,
invited to that, Shannan.
What? I know.
I want to
It
be
was
invited to that.
it was so interesting, and I was so cold, but it was great. And and then in the summers they were having worship, like on like next to the Hudson River or something. But then something, it's always like, where is the Holy Spirit working? Like what she didn't imagine was there was all these other people who were having trouble coming to, traditional church again because their children had developmental disabilities like autism, and being inside of a church building felt constraining, or they felt like as parents it was hard to be in that constrained worship space with their kids. But if they were outside at a park and the kids could walk around and the worship space was so much more open, they could participate in a community so much more easily. And so what she originally started it to be ended up continuing to be what it was, but it then morphed into something even bigger. But they had this spirit of openness where they could receive these new people that were coming and having another need that needed to be met. And I always tell that story because I just felt like it's such a great story about ministry, of that you might think you're going down one road, but God's going to show up and maybe show you a different road, or an evolving road, right? And being willing to follow what's being set out for you in ministry and see what you can do with it. And having that spirit of welcome and openness.
I think
Um,
that is a beautiful story, an example
yeah.
of that, Shannon, because I think one of the gifts that new worshiping communities bring to the larger church is that posture of openness, right?
Yes.
And they can show us what the Spirit can do with that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's beautiful. And the dog just got something out of my little trash can, and
Oh,
I'm going to hear the little wrapper rattling down there because I had some Belvita cookies at my computer this morning. But they have this posture that's
yeah.
open, right?
Yes.
And a willingness to pivot and
Mm-hmm.
change
Yes.
when they learn. And you can start with a really clear vision of what you're
Yes.
called to, but then God can offer something else to you, right? And when we're willing to embrace that, beautiful things grow,
Yeah.
unexpected things. So I think that's a great example because it is a true thing about new worshiping communities.
Yeah. It's
And
been
and-
years since I've connected to that ministry, but that story continues to like fuel me as I do my work, right?
Right. Isn't that great?
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
wanted to just piggyback on something that Nikki said, that it get that the new worshiping communities, they give space to something new, something different, and they're open. And I think that one of the problems that we have in legacy churches is that sometimes they can become very closed off, very entrenched. And part of what I love about the initiative that we do is we're trying to get some of these legacy churches that are entrenched, who realize that they can continue to do what they're doing and not grow in some, and not grow numerically, but grow spiritually and in some really in-depth ways.
Mm.
The initiative can help people to become more open to what God is calling them to do. And so Nikki and I have talked about this, but I have always seen some similarities in the work that the new worshiping communities does and the work that we do in Vital Congregations, where they're working with brand new communities. We're working with legacy churches, but we're trying to also, with those churches, get them to be more open to what God is calling them to do and to be more open to possibility, and to honor things that they may have done in the past that they can no longer do, but to look forward to the future, to what God is calling them into. And I just see some of those points of similarity between NWC and VCI, and I really love a lot of what Nikki and those do in her area.
Mm-hmm.
Can really be incorporated into some degree into some of the things that we do in Vital Congregations and vice versa. Because the marks, and Nikki, you can tell us, yours are not called marks. What are you have 6
We have
areas?
we call them 6 indicators of transformation, where we kind of
Yeah.
have looked at what is the good, what is the change that's happening in the church and in the world through starting new worshiping communities. So identified about 6 things that we see are basically they're the fruit of this movement. So yeah.
And I think that those indicators some are very similar to the marks that we use, if they're similar in nature. But I really do see a lot of intersectionality in what Nikki does in her office and some of what we do in our office. And so I just think it's all really beautiful. The whole idea, I think, behind both of them is to get people, first of all, to come together as a community and to develop a relationship with Christ in new and refreshing ways. So.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that last piece you just said, Veronica, is really, the most important piece, right? Developing a relationship with Christ, right? And that is our work as the church. And also, I love that piece at the end of the marks of membership in the Book of Order is that evaluating I forget the exact wording in the Book of Order, but it says basically it says evaluating your own discipleship on a regular basis, developing a regularity of evaluating your own discipleship. And I know there's churches that do like a New Year's Eve service or sort of a watch night service where they kind of recommit for a year. Some churches have like a word for a year, things like this. And all of these sorts of ways that we might use to refocus our own discipleship, refresh who we are in Jesus Christ, refresh how we do our ministry, how we see our lives, how we engage in a community, can be very powerful. That call is not to stagnation. And so that can certainly show up when you're in what you call like a legacy ministry, but also a new worshiping community can develop new ways as well. And hopefully those things are talking to each other, right, within a presbytery. And we were talking about that when we were out visiting with this new worshiping community a few weeks ago, myself and the liaison from the Commission on Ministry, about how are there ways we can get your story told more in the presbytery, and how can more people from the presbytery visit and be a part of what you're doing. And some of that for us is a geographic challenge, being a presbytery spread out over multiple states that are also in a very high traffic area between Boston and New York City, right? So we have some challenges that are sort of structural, but also needing to create sort of pathways and connections between ministries, for the building up of the whole body, right? And thinking of ways we can move forward in ministry. So this is also helpful. Are there other pieces related to Matthew 25 that you all want to highlight, or ways that you connect with other pieces of the Matthew 25 initiative?
Shannan, one of the things that comes to mind for me, and because I know you're coming to this later in your podcast series about the intersectionality of things, and I think so many of our new worshiping communities you described are kind of niche, like they are focusing on a narrow slice of people who are not in the church, often related to their intersectional identities, right? We are moving to the margins, and a lot of the reasons people are marginalized are because of the different parts of multiple parts of their identity or life that has pushed them to the edges. And so I really, really am grateful for the courage of leaders who are willing to go and be there, and help make safe space for folks on the margins to become again part of the church, because it brings us so much creativity, and it broadens our own identity as the church and as the people of God. So it is vitality and vibrancy when we are a bigger group of people. I was listening to another presbytery executive recently talk about how new worshiping communities are functioning in her presbytery, and she referred to it as enlarging the we. And I think that's a beautiful phrase. It's Aisha Brooks Johnson in Atlanta, so everybody can know who said that. But this is how we are enlarging the we. And I just think that that's a big piece of it.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and I would add to that to say that I think part of, you talked about the other stools or the other parts of Matthew 25, the vision of Matthew 25. And I think that, again, as churches discern the work that they're doing in their communities, as they listen to the people in those communities, that you might find a church that's in a community where is very impoverished. And if that church is able to hear the voices of the people in the community, they might go about doing the part of their work might be in helping to eradicate systemic poverty, to help people to, they might start a program that helps people to get jobs or to get job training or to get education and those types of things that might give them the ability to overcome systemic poverty. And to eradicate it. And then you might have another church in another community that might, it might be, for instance, say a white church that over the years, the community around them has changed and has become more Black or brown or Asian or Latino or whatever the case may be. And they might in their building relationships with the community might stand together and partner with that community to help dismantle structural racism. And I think that, and then there might be other parts of it. I know that there are other parts of Matthew 25. You've got the three-legged stool, but then there are other parts of it. And so as the church discerns, they may begin to, as God leads them to do work in the areas of Matthew 25. And they might not even realize they're doing that kind of work, but this in listening to the voices and partnering and standing with the people, they might actually help in the other leg stools of Matthew 25, the vision for Matthew 25.
Yeah, it's helpful. I hear so much as we talk about, integrated ministry, integrated fullness of our own lives as disciples, and ways to show up out in the world, which is really the whole point of being church today, right? Is to show up and express what it is to be people who follow and love Jesus and who are interested in bringing ministry of healing and transformation to our world, which, we could go on and on about, all the challenges we have, but there's so much joy and opportunity in all of that as well. So as we close up today, there's something I've been asking people lately on our podcasts. There's this other podcast I listen to, which is about the climate crisis, but so it's very niche, very specific, but it's called Outrage and Optimism. And they ask people to share one thing they're outraged about when they're closing up and one thing that makes them optimistic about their work. And so, sort of a Presbyterian church way of putting that is like, what's a challenge you're experiencing today in your ministry where you're like, oh, I wish it could be so different, or I'd like it to shift. And then also, where are you seeing the Holy Spirit show up and take us in new and fresh and exciting ways and directions? What's that like for either of you in your ministry as we close up?
I'll go first on that one then. Outraged, challenges. I would say that, as you know, working in the church is full of challenges. And I think that if not all churches, in many churches, I mentioned before about churches being stuck and or entrenched. And I don't know that outraged might be a bit of a strong word for this, but I do think it is a challenge for many churches to get unstuck, to just kind of lift their heads up from the sand and just kind of take a broader look at the world around them and to open themselves up to Christ's calling. Or God's calling into the work, into the field, to actually, what I always say is get your hands dirty in ministry, to actually get out there and do some of the work, and to meet needs, to really just talk to people and meet with people and to really fellowship with people other than the people who just darken the doors of your church. So I think that if anything, that would be if you're going to outrage or a challenge. I think the thing that gives me hope, though, is that God is in the midst of it all. And that sometimes, even when churches do get entrenched, that God has a way of helping people to see things differently. And it can come about in very different ways. Sometimes it can happen when somebody has a personal encounter that has nothing to do with the church. It might be something that happens to them in their home or in their neighborhood or on their jobs. And it can have a life-changing effect upon them. And they might bring that back to the church and say, we've got to do better. So I'm optimistic that, and hopeful that because God is still in the mix and God is still involved in the work, that God's will be done.
Thanks, Veronica. Nikki, what's this like for you?
Outrage is not a word I use very much, so
you don't have to use it.
That's a challenge to think about what I'm outraged about. But I'll tell you what gets under my skin pretty darn bad is scarcity, and the scarcity mindset that we all fall into, right? But often in church and in mid-council ministry, there's not enough resources to do this. We have so many churches that need support. We can't put energy into starting new churches. We don't have enough members ourselves, so don't start a new worshiping community nearby us because they'll take away people who might come and join our church. And the newsflash there is they're not coming to your church. Like they're probably, if they're not there, they're not going to be there. But starting something new might be a place where they can find an access point to the church. But because the truth of it is there's an abundance of people in our world who are not connected to a church. Yes. So there's plenty of work for all of us to do. The harvest is plentiful and the laborers are few. And that, is opportunity. But God is a God of abundance. And there is more than enough if we open our eyes and our hearts to what God can do. I serve once a month a tiny little church in North Georgia, and we were talking about the loaves and fishes this Sunday. And I asked him, do you believe, we did it as a conversation, do you believe in miracles? And like everybody around the tables, yes. It's just a matter of training our eyes to see the ordinary miracles that are around us and to make room for what God can do in and among us. And so I think we have to train our eyes towards God's abundance. And I see that in new worshiping communities that do things on shoestrings and with duct tape and just make it work. And I see it when congregations say, yeah, we want to help this young, scrappy, starting thing get on their feet. And presbyteries say, yeah, we've got a lot of struggling churches and we're going to invest in things that are new because we trust God can do this.
That's when the ordinary becomes extraordinary.
Amen.
Yes.
Yeah. It's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Nikki. Thank you so much, Veronica, for being willing to chat for a little while and be part of this Matthew 25 series for our presbytery, which we hope will be a blessing and a ministry incubator and for the new year as we get started in ministry. And we'll have some resources about these two ministries, Vital Congregations, New Worshiping Communities, and that'll be linked in our podcast notes. I just want to say I'm so grateful to each of you for your ministry, for the work you're doing as being ambassadors for Matthew 25, but also as people who are disciples of Jesus who love and care for the church and for all that we're about. So thank you so much to both of you. And thanks for being part of our conversations.
Thank you for having us.
It's great to be here.
Thank you.